Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to wake up in a world where every sunrise promised not hope, but danger? Can you imagine opening your eyes with the knowledge that survival was never guaranteed? That even the warmth of your family's fire might not protect you when shadows carried other humans who hungered, feared, and hated just as much as you did? Tens of thousands of years ago, before the first words were carved into stone and before kingdoms raised banners into the sky, there were only small tribes scattered across a merciless land. These people did not dream of power or wealth. They dreamed of meat on the fire, of warmth against the biting frost, of making it through one more night alive. The forests stretched endlessly, filled with predators whose eyes glowed in the dark. But the greatest threat was not the beasts, it was each other. Across valleys and ridges, fires glimmered like rival stars, and every flame carried the promise of fear. It was not conquest they sought, but survival. The cold whispered to them, hunger gnawed at them, and the silence between tribes grew heavy with suspicion. If they did not strike first, they believed they would surely fall. Thus, the war began, not with drums or banners, but with whispers, with eyes that narrowed, with hands that gripped sharpened stone. Tonight, this memory still lingers in the bones buried beneath our feet, silent witnesses of a war that should never have been.
What would it mean to live in a world where trust itself could kill you? Could you sit by the fire, watching the sparks dance into the night, and feel safe, knowing that beyond the trees, another tribe was staring back at you, weighing your life against their hunger? In the Ice Age, suspicion was not weakness, it was survival. Every glance carried the weight of fear. Every gesture could be read as a threat. When food was scarce and the cold merciless, even the cry of a newborn in the night could become a signal of vulnerability. Imagine a mother cradling her child, whispering softly to keep it quiet, while across the ridge, hunters listened, waiting for that cry to betray the tribe's location. And when they came, they did not arrive as organized armies, but as shadows slipping through the trees, as stone blades flashing in the firelight. Blood stained the snow, bones cracked under desperate hands, and the echoes of screams rose into the sky. There were no treaties, no negotiations, no rules, only kill or be killed. The brutal war that almost ended humanity was not waged in grand battles, but in small, savage clashes where mercy had no place. Its legacy was written not in chronicles, but in shattered bones and silent graves.
Can you imagine a night so long, so heavy, that every sound felt like a promise of death? Have you felt the weight of silence so deep that even your own heartbeat betrayed you, reminding you that you were prey as much as predator? For those tribes, survival was not about living, it was about not dying. The war that consumed them did not have heroes or villains. It was a cycle of fear that swallowed both attacker and victim alike. When one tribe raided another, they left behind not victory, but graves, smoldering fires, and orphans who carried scars deeper than flesh. The bones buried beneath ancient soil tell the story we can no longer hear. Skulls split open, skeletons tangled together in shallow pits, evidence of massacres that speak louder than any legend. And yet, against all odds, some survived. They fled into caves. They huddled together against the cold. They adapted.
Those survivors carried the memory of terror in their blood, and through them, humanity endured. In their endurance, the story of our species continued, carved not in triumph, but in resilience, born from pain, yet leading to survival.
Long before the first spear was raised against another human, the world itself was already a merciless opponent, shaping every breath of life into a struggle for survival. The landscape was dominated by ice and stone, the earth carved by glaciers that moved like slow titans across the land. Winters lasted longer than memory, with winds so sharp they could strip the warmth from a body in moments. And summers were brief and unforgiving, never yielding enough bounty to erase the hunger carried from the season before. Forests towered in endless lines of dark trunks, their shadows thick and heavy, concealing predators that waited with patient cruelty. Saber-toothed cats, their fangs long as daggers, prowled silently beneath the canopy. Dire wolves, larger and stronger than any wolf known today, moved in packs that seemed endless, their howls rolling like thunder through frozen valleys. Even the ground itself was a threat, fractured with ice that could swallow a careless step. Rivers that froze solid only to break suddenly, pulling the unwary into freezing depths. Humanity, fragile and small, had no palaces or walls to protect it, no weapons of iron or shields of bronze. There were only sharpened stones, crude clubs, and the courage to face another day. Survival meant wrapping thin hides around shivering bodies, gathering firewood that burned too quickly, and hoping that the flames would last the night. The world gave little and took much, forcing every creature to fight for the smallest scraps of safety. In such a place, compassion was rare, for kindness could mean starvation. Every tribe that lived in this age learned the same truth. The earth did not forgive weakness, and those who hesitated were erased. It was in this crucible of ice and hunger that humanity was shaped, hardened by necessity, molded by desperation, and prepared, without knowing it, for a conflict far darker than even the predators or storms that surrounded them. In this unforgiving world, tribes formed not out of choice, but from the absolute necessity of survival. A family alone in the wilderness could not endure the endless hunger or resist the predators that moved like shadows through the forests. So families gathered, bound not by luxury or wealth, but by the simple need to share warmth, to divide the labor of hunting, and to keep the fire alive when storms threatened to extinguish it. Their shelters were fragile things, built from branches, bones, and hides, nothing more than thin barriers against the relentless cold. Yet inside those shelters beat the fragile rhythm of human survival. Fire was sacred, its light not only a comfort, but a warning to the darkness that humanity still endured. Each flame carried stories told in whispers, reminders that survival depended not just on strength, but on vigilance. Hunting was constant, and every day brought the question of whether enough food could be found to feed the mouths that waited by the fire. A single bison brought hope for weeks, its meat divided carefully, its hide stretched into clothing, its bones sharpened into tools. But when prey was scarce, the fires grew dimmer, and hunger hollowed faces until only desperation remained. Scarcity was the invisible master of all decisions, dictating whether a tribe moved across frozen rivers in search of new valleys or risked battle with predators to claim a meal. Even water, though seemingly abundant, could betray. Rivers swelled with dangerous currents, their icy surfaces breaking suddenly beneath careless steps. And when another fire was seen flickering across the ridge, unease settled deep into the hearts of those who watched. Two tribes could not easily share the same hunting ground. For every deer taken by one was a loss for the other. Every fish pulled from the river, every patch of berries gathered from the forest meant less for rivals nearby. The land was vast, but the places where life could cling were few, and those rare havens became arenas of silent competition. Even in the quiet, the presence of others was felt as a shadow, an unspoken reminder that survival was fragile, and the margin between life and death could be erased by nothing more than a single failed hunt.
The world before the war was already shaping humanity into something harder, more resilient, and more ruthless than it had ever been. Bodies grew lean and strong, muscles tempered not by luxury, but by endless marches through snow and by the ceaseless labor of survival. Stomachs learned to endure emptiness, stretching the smallest scraps of meat or handfuls of roots into sustenance for days. Minds sharpened under constant threat, developing a deep instinct to sense danger in the crack of a branch, the shift of a shadow, the sudden silence of birds overhead. This was not progress as we understand it today, but adaptation born from necessity, each trait etched into the flesh and spirit of those who lived long enough to pass them forward. Compassion was the first sacrifice in this harsh equation, for mercy risked resources that could not be spared. To feed another mouth without gaining strength in return was to invite weakness, and weakness was a debt that nature collected swiftly. Violence, therefore, was not an aberration, but a tool, as vital as fire or stone, as much a part of life as the air drawn into weary lungs. The lessons of the earth were brutal and absolute. Hesitate, and you die. Trust too much, and you die. Forget the cold's cruelty, and you die. Over time, these lessons sank into bone, not as stories told around the fire, but as instincts carried silently through generations. And when the first spark of conflict finally ignited, when hunger deepened and fear swelled until it could no longer be contained, the brutality that erupted was not surprising but inevitable. Long before the first blow was struck, the conditions for war had already been written into the rhythm of daily survival. The forests had taught humans to be predators. The storms had taught them to endure pain. The endless scarcity had taught them that only the ruthless would remain standing. In this way, the land itself was the author of violence, shaping the people until war was not a choice, but the next chapter in their existence. Humanity's first great conflict did not erupt suddenly out of madness or cruelty, but grew naturally from the merciless soil of the world before it, a soil watered with hunger and hardened by ice. The world gave no peace, and so its children carried none within them.
The first spark of conflict did not come with a roar of drums or the clash of armies, but with a silence heavy enough to fracture trust. Across a frozen valley, the smoke of two fires drifted upward into the gray sky, their plumes twisting like rival signals to the heavens. One belonged to a tribe that had settled near the river, building their fragile shelters from bone and hide, believing they had found safety in the abundance of fish and the sheltering trees. The other belonged to a group who had wandered long, their bodies weakened by hunger, their eyes sharpened by desperation. At first, the sight of another fire was nothing more than an uneasy reminder that the land was not theirs alone. But in the quiet that followed, unease grew into suspicion, and suspicion hardened into fear. Every deer taken from the forest meant fewer for the others. Every fish pulled from the river was a stolen breath of life. At night, the glow of distant flames became unbearable, a constant reminder that survival was fragile, that another tribe's existence threatened one's own. Winter deepened, food dwindled, and faces grew hollow. Murmurs began to stir within the camps, whispers carried from one mouth to another until they took the shape of intent. Spears were sharpened not only for the hunt, but for something darker. Stones were chipped into edges meant for flesh rather than hide. And when the first footsteps pressed silently into the snow, when hunters crept through the trees toward the camp of rivals, the spark was struck. What began as fear became action, and what began as action became blood. There was no declaration, no warning, no line drawn between peace and war. There was only the sound of breathing in the dark, the flash of a blade, and the moment when survival transformed into slaughter. That first strike, simple and brutal, was the point from which there was no return, the silent birth of a war that would consume them all. The first raid was carried out in silence, a shadow creeping between the trees, a handful of hunters transformed into killers by the demands of hunger. They moved under the cover of night, their bodies painted with ash to blend into the darkness, their breath shallow and controlled so as not to betray their presence. In their hands they carried spears tipped with chipped stone, heavy clubs carved from thick branches, and daggers shaped from sharpened bones. The rival camp slept, the flames of its fire burning low, the soft sounds of children's dreams mingling with the steady rhythm of adults exhausted from the day's hunt. The attackers struck swiftly, their blades cutting through hide tents, their weapons falling on sleeping bodies. The snow drank blood in silence, steam rising into the frozen air as life was torn away without warning. Mothers tried to clutch their children, only to collapse under the weight of blows that shattered bone. Elders, too weak to resist, were dispatched with ruthless efficiency. The raid was not a battle, not a clash between equal sides, but a massacre carried out against the unsuspecting, a desperate attempt to secure food, warmth, and dominance. At dawn, the attackers slipped back into the forest, leaving behind chaos, fire, and death. The survivors awoke to a nightmare, their world reduced to ashes and corpses, their grief bound to a single truth: retaliation would come. The fragile line between coexistence and annihilation had been crossed, and what was taken in blood would only be answered with more blood. There was no longer space for caution, no longer hope for peace. The first raid had shattered whatever fragile balance existed, and in its wake lay only the certainty of a cycle that would consume both tribes until nothing remained but the echo of their violence.
The retaliation came with a fury that mirrored the first strike, and in that moment the spark grew into fire. The surviving tribe, their grief hardened into rage, gathered what little strength they had. They buried their dead quickly in shallow graves, their faces hollow with sorrow, but their eyes sharpened with vengeance. Children who had survived clung to elders while the hunters sharpened their weapons, not with the calm precision of crafting tools for hunting, but with the trembling intensity of preparing for slaughter. Spears were tipped with obsidian shards scavenged from the earth, clubs reinforced with stone, and knives carved sharper than before. They moved before the next moonrise, unwilling to wait, unwilling to let their enemies believe that fear could silence them. When they struck, it was not in silence, but in cries that split the cold night, cries born of grief and rage. Tents were torn down, flames lit deliberately to engulf shelters, and the once hidden weapons of stone and bone became instruments of merciless punishment. The attackers sought not only to reclaim what had been stolen, but to carve fear into the hearts of those who had dared to spill innocent blood. Bodies fell in the snow,
Warriors clashed hand to hand, and the air filled with the stench of burning hide and the metallic taste of blood. What began as a raid for survival now erupted into a cycle of vengeance, an endless spiral where each death demanded another, where every life taken became fuel for the next strike. No one spoke of peace. No one remembered coexistence. The forest itself seemed to tremble under the weight of hatred, its shadows filled with the echoes of screams and the crash of weapons striking bone. This was no longer a conflict over food or shelter. It had become something darker, a chain reaction that could not be broken, a war in which every tribe was dragged down into the abyss of violence. The spark that had begun in silence had now grown into an inferno, and humanity, fragile and few in number, stood on the edge of destruction, threatened not by beasts or storms, but by the merciless hands of its own kind.
Long before iron was drawn from the earth, or bronze was hammered into blades, the first weapons of brutality were nothing more than stones shaped by hand, and bones repurposed from the carcasses of beasts. Primitive though they may appear to our modern eyes, in their time they were tools of survival and instruments of terror, crafted with patience and wielded with desperation. Imagine the careful striking of flint against flint, the steady rhythm of a hunter's hands working until sharp edges appeared, jagged and lethal. Each fracture of the stone was a decision. Each shard chipped away a step closer to a weapon that could pierce flesh, crack bone, and end life with a single blow. These tools, born from necessity, were crude but effective. A sharpened spear of wood, tipped with stone, could bring down prey or pierce the chest of an enemy. A heavy branch, carved and weighted with rocks, became a club capable of shattering skulls. The bones of animals were sharpened into daggers, the ribs of mammoths filed into points, the jawbones of predators adapted into weapons that tore with equal ferocity. There was no artistry in these designs, no flourish of craftsmanship, only the raw simplicity of function, to kill swiftly, to kill surely, to kill without hesitation. The intimacy of these weapons was what made them so brutal, for they required closeness between attacker and victim. To wield them was to stand within arm's reach, to feel the resistance of muscle and the sudden collapse of bone. Blood sprayed not from a distance, but onto the hands, the face, the body of the killer, mingling the lives of predator and prey into one violent act. In every strike, the warrior shared in the impact, felt the tremor of bone meeting stone, carried the echo of violence in their own body. The brutality of these weapons was not just in the wounds they inflicted, but in the experience they demanded, a closeness that fused killing with survival until the two became indistinguishable.
The evolution of these weapons mirrored the evolution of fear itself, for each strike of violence taught lessons that were carried into the next battle. When a tribe discovered that a club embedded with shards of stone could break a skull more easily than a plain branch, they passed that knowledge along, and soon the forests echoed with the crack of reinforced wood meeting bone. Spears grew longer, their shafts smoothed to fly straighter, their tips hardened in fire before being bound with sinew to sharp stone. Arrows were crafted with patience, each one feathered with care, not for sport, but for the certainty of piercing flesh. The making of weapons became ritualistic, a task shared by hands that trembled not from fear, but from hunger and urgency. Children watched elders chip flint, learning that survival depended not on kindness, but on the precision of edges honed to kill. Each tool was born of desperation, shaped by the necessity of turning raw nature into something that could conquer life itself. The brutality was not only in the weapon's design, but in its usage. A jagged axe did not cut cleanly, it crushed and tore, leaving wounds that festered, ensuring death even if the first strike failed. Spears penetrated deep but often broke inside the body, making removal impossible and pain eternal. Arrows tipped with fire turned shelters into pyres, sending smoke and screams into the night sky. To hold such a weapon was to embrace the weight of its purpose, to acknowledge that its existence was tethered to the destruction of another living being. These instruments were not distant tools of war. They demanded presence, demanded blood, demanded the killer to witness the life leaving the eyes of their victim. And so, with each weapon fashioned, humanity hardened further, until the act of killing became not a question of morality, but a rhythm of survival, echoing in every sharpened edge and in every fire-hardened spear tip thrust into flesh.
The brutality of these weapons was reflected not only in the way they were forged or in the pain they inflicted, but also in the legacy they left upon the landscape of human memory. Every battlefield, if it could be called such, was littered with broken spears, shattered clubs, and blood-soaked stones that told the story of violence without words. The ground itself became scarred by conflict, fire-blackened earth where shelters once stood, pits where bodies were buried hastily, and caves whose walls bore the scratches of sharpened blades testing their edges. Each weapon was more than a tool. It was a fragment of identity, an extension of the arm, a declaration that survival had been chosen over mercy. To carry one was to live with the certainty that its weight would one day fall upon flesh, and to strike with it was to acknowledge that life could be taken as easily as wood could be split. Over time, the familiarity with these instruments dulled the horror of their use, turning the act of killing into a grim routine, an expectation rather than an exception. Yet the wounds they left, both physical and psychological, lingered long after the blows had fallen. Survivors carried scars across their skin, reminders carved into their bodies that the weapons had done their work. Tribes carried scars within their memories, shaping their traditions, their stories, and their fears around the knowledge that violence was always near. The weapons, crude and primitive as they seem now, became the foundation of power. For those who possessed the sharpest blades, the heaviest clubs, and the deadliest arrows controlled not only food and shelter, but the fragile thread of life itself. In this way, the war was not fought only with hunger and fear, but with the very tools that men and women had shaped with their own hands, tools that bound them to the cycle of violence as tightly as fire bound them to the night. These were not weapons of glory, nor of honor, but of raw necessity, and in their brutal simplicity they etched a permanent mark upon the soul of humanity.
The first true massacre of this forgotten war was not a single clash of warriors, but the deliberate annihilation of an entire camp, carried out with the ruthless precision of people who had been pushed beyond desperation. It began at dawn, when the frost still clung to the ground and the air was sharp with the bite of winter. A rival tribe, hardened by hunger and driven by vengeance, descended upon their enemies with weapons already stained from earlier raids. The defenders, unprepared for such ferocity, scrambled from their shelters only to meet the force of sharpened spears and clubs weighted with stone. The screams of children were drowned beneath the roar of fire as tents were set ablaze, their thin hides curling and collapsing into ash. Warriors fought bravely, but they were outnumbered, their weapons clashing against the relentless tide of attackers. Bodies fell quickly, some with throats cut in silence, others collapsing under crushing blows that split bone. Blood spread across the snow, steaming in the morning light, painting the earth with the memory of violence that would never fade.
Those who tried to flee were hunted down, their tracks in the frost betraying them to merciless pursuers who struck without pause or pity. By midday, the camp was nothing more than smoke and ruin, the survivors few and broken. Mothers lay lifeless beside their children. Elders were butchered where they sat, and the hunters who had once carried pride in their strength now lay scattered among the wreckage. What remained was not a battlefield, but a graveyard, silent except for the crackle of burning wood and the distant calls of carrion birds circling overhead. This was no battle for territory or honor. It was a slaughter carried out to erase rivals from existence, to claim their resources, and to send a message that survival belonged only to the most brutal. In that silence after the screams, the tribe responsible believed they had secured their future. Instead, they had set a precedent. For now, no tribe could live without the certainty that annihilation might come with the rising of the next sun.
The aftermath of that massacre rippled outward like a shock wave, shaking not just the survivors, but every tribe within reach of the smoke. Word of the slaughter traveled swiftly, carried by whispers and the sight of blackened earth where families once lived. Fears settled deep into the bones of those who heard the stories, for they understood now that survival was not merely about enduring the cold or outlasting the beasts of the wilderness. It was about enduring each other, about bracing for the moment when neighbors would turn into executioners. Tribes began to move more often, abandoning valleys they had called home, seeking refuge in caves hidden deep within the mountains or forests, so dense that even sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Yet even in exile, they could not escape the shadow of violence, for the hunger that had driven one tribe to slaughter would drive others to do the same. Camps shrank in size. Fires were built smaller and shielded by stone to avoid detection. Voices lowered into murmurs so that the night would not carry them to listening ears. Every crack of a branch, every flicker of light in the distance became a warning that the same fate could descend without mercy. The cycle of raids grew harsher, no longer limited to stealing food or claiming hunting grounds, but spiraling into acts of pure devastation. Men carried torches into rival shelters, burning them to ash before any defense could rise. Women and children, once spared in the chaos of survival, were now hunted as deliberately as warriors, for no tribe could risk leaving behind survivors who might one day return to avenge the dead. In these massacres, the line between hunter and hunted blurred, until all that remained was prey, and the prey was humanity itself. Each tribe lived with the awareness that their existence was fragile, their numbers already too small to endure repeated loss. And yet, in their fear, they struck harder, killing more, until the land itself seemed to mourn beneath the weight of blood spilled upon it. The silence of the forests was broken not by birdsong, but by the echoes of screams that faded too quickly, leaving only the emptiness of extinguished lives.
The spiral of bloodshed pushed humanity to the edge of disappearance, for each massacre did not simply weaken a tribe, but carved away at the fragile foundation of the species itself. Populations were already small, scattered thinly across vast landscapes, their survival balanced on the knife's edge of chance. Every time a tribe was wiped out, it was not just dozens of lives lost, but a generation erased, a lineage cut short, knowledge of the land and its secrets buried with the dead. The earth began to hold too many shallow graves, each one a reminder that humans were destroying themselves faster than nature ever could. Where once there had been villages of laughter, the smoke of fires, and the rhythm of tools shaping stone, there was now silence.
broken only by the howl of wolves reclaiming territory left empty by slaughter. The survivors, gaunt and haunted, carried scars not only on their bodies, but in their minds. They moved through the land like ghosts, distrustful of every shadow, weary of every sign of life beyond their own circle of firelight. In some places, entire regions were emptied, their tribes reduced to nothing, their shelters collapsing into ruins that would vanish beneath snow and time. This near extinction was not the work of famine alone or the cruelty of winter storms, but of deliberate human hands turned against their own kind. Archaeologists, millennia later, would uncover pits of bones, skulls split by stone blades, skeletons marked with the sharp, deliberate wounds of weapons rather than the random violence of animals. These silent witnesses tell the truth. Humanity nearly ended not because of nature's wrath, but because of its own brutality. In those years of endless war, the population dwindled so dangerously that survival seemed unlikely. Only small bands endured, clinging together in remote places, hiding in caves, or wandering far into new lands to escape the cycle of vengeance. These few carried with them the memory of fire and blood, the weight of lives lost, and the resilience to push forward despite the devastation. From their survival, humanity continued, but forever changed, scarred by the knowledge that it had nearly erased itself in the pursuit of survival. The massacre was not just an event, it was a turning point, a moment when humanity stood on the brink of its own extinction, a reminder that the greatest threat to mankind has often been mankind itself.
When the flames of war had consumed too many lives and the ground was littered with bones, it was not the strongest who endured, but the few who managed to hide, adapt, and endure in silence. Survival in those years was not measured by victory in battle, but by the ability to remain unseen, to slip into shadows and avoid the reach of vengeance. Families fled into caves carved deep into cliffs, their entrances hidden by snow or forest, places where the echoes of wind concealed the faint crackle of a fire. These caves became sanctuaries, wombs of stone that sheltered the last threads of humanity from extinction. Inside them, the air was damp, the walls cold, but the fragile glow of flame brought a kind of fragile safety. Children learned to move silently, their games replaced by the stillness of listening, their laughter stifled so predators, both human and beast, would not hear. Food was scarce, often reduced to roots pulled from frozen earth or scraps of meat stripped from carcasses left behind by larger predators. Water dripped from rocks or was carried carefully from streams at night when no enemy could see. Each day was a calculation, each step outside a risk weighed against starvation. The warriors who had once wielded their clubs and spears now crouched in darkness, sharpening their weapons quietly, not in preparation for conquest, but in case discovery came. The war had scattered humanity into fragments, and those fragments learned that silence was their greatest weapon. In hidden valleys, in forests too thick to navigate easily, in mountains whose peaks tore at the sky, these few remained, small and desperate, yet determined. They endured not because they were fearless, but because fear had taught them caution, and caution had preserved their lives. In their hearts, they carried the memory of fire, blood, and screams, but also the knowledge that to survive was to endure quietly, waiting for the storm of violence to pass. The survivors who endured in those hidden corners of the world carried within them the resilience of generations shaped by hardship. They learned to adapt in ways that others could not, reshaping their daily lives around scarcity, danger, and silence. Hunting became a shadowed act,
carried out under cover of darkness or during storms when the noise of wind masked their movements. The meat of small animals, birds, and fish became precious beyond measure, divided with care so that every mouth had at least a taste, even if never enough to satisfy hunger. Clothing was patched endlessly, hides softened and stitched until they bore little resemblance to their original form, yet still served as fragile armor against the cold. Tools were repaired again and again, their edges sharpened with meticulous patience, because new stone was often too dangerous to gather far from safety. Children grew into adulthood not with the boldness of warriors, but with the quiet patience of survivors, their skills honed in the art of endurance rather than conquest. They knew the sound of shifting snow, the rhythm of predator calls, the ways to conceal firelight so it would not betray their position. Fear was no longer paralyzing, but became a guide, shaping every movement and every decision. Communities shrank into tightly bound units, where trust was absolute because betrayal meant extinction. Songs, if they were sung at all, were whispers carried only within the echoing chambers of caves, their melodies less about joy and more about remembrance, laments for those lost in the fire of war. These acts of survival did not erase the trauma of what had been endured. Instead, they carved it deeper into the identity of those who remained. The memory of massacres lingered in every silence, pressing down on each choice, reminding the survivors that they lived not because of strength or numbers, but because of caution and persistence. In this way, the few who remained became the carriers of human endurance, embodying the fragile thread of existence that would one day expand again, but was, in that moment, stretched dangerously thin.
The legacy of those who survived was not measured in monuments or victories, but in the fragile continuity of life itself. Their existence was carved into the land through footprints that disappeared with the melting snow, through fires that left only faint scars on stone, through bones buried shallowly beneath the earth where predators or time would scatter them. Yet within their veins flowed the endurance of a species that refused to vanish, a resilience that would shape all who came after. They lived through winters so long that hunger became a constant ache, through nights so cold that bodies huddled together in silence, sharing warmth as though it were the last barrier against oblivion. They endured storms that tore across valleys, driving snow into walls of white that blinded eyes and buried paths. Yet they emerged again when the winds ceased, battered but alive. These people, reduced in number and stripped of certainty, carried forward the knowledge that survival required not only strength of body, but also strength of memory. They remembered the screams that had filled the nights of massacre, the glow of flames consuming villages, the sight of kin cut down by stone blades. They carried those memories like invisible wounds, reminders that peace was fragile and trust dangerous. Yet they also carried hope, though it was a quiet hope, expressed not in words, but in the act of continuing, in the birth of children who represented defiance against extinction, in the planting of fire each evening as a refusal to surrender to the darkness. Their survival was not a triumph sung in celebration, but a whisper carried across centuries, proof that even when reduced to almost nothing, humanity could endure. And from their endurance came the thread that would weave the future, fragile yet unbroken, scarred yet unyielding. The few who survived became the root of continuity, their lives the narrow bridge that carried the species across a chasm of near destruction. In their hidden caves and silent valleys, they preserved the possibility of tomorrow, holding on to it with hands blistered by cold and spirits battered by fear, and in doing so ensured that the story of humanity would not end in blood and silence, but continue, scarred though it was, into the ages that followed.
When the fires of war finally dimmed and the echoes of slaughter faded into silence, what remained was not triumph, but emptiness, a hollow quiet that settled over lands once filled with voices, laughter, and the rhythm of survival. Valleys that had been alive with the glow of camps now lay barren, their shelters reduced to charred skeletons of wood and bone. The ground was littered with fragments of stone tools, broken and scattered, silent reminders of the lives that had wielded them. Shallow graves dotted the landscape, hastily dug pits where the dead had been placed in numbers too great to honor individually. Many were never buried at all, their bones left to bleach beneath the sun, or to be carried away by predators that reclaimed the earth from human hands. The survivors who walked these lands did so like shadows, moving with caution through the ruins of what had once been homes, haunted by the memories of those who had perished. The war had not ended because peace had been chosen, but because there were too few left to continue fighting. Exhaustion and loss hung over every camp, pressing down like a weight that could not be lifted. Tribes shrank into fragments, their numbers reduced to the edge of disappearance, and in their silence they began to carry the lessons carved by violence. They learned that unchecked fear devoured not only enemies but also kin, that vengeance demanded more blood than any stomach could hold, and that survival could not come from endless slaughter. The war had left scars deeper than flesh, scars carved into memory, into tradition, into the very rhythm of daily life. These scars became warnings passed in whispers, reminders that humanity's greatest threat had not been the beasts of the forest or the storms of the sky, but the merciless hand of its own kind.
The aftermath of the brutal conflict reshaped the fragile fabric of humanity, imprinting lessons so profound that they lingered long after the blood had dried. Survivors carried these lessons within them, etched into their instincts as deeply as scars upon their bodies. Tribes that had once trusted freely now moved with suspicion, measuring every stranger as a potential threat. The memory of betrayal and slaughter lingered in their bones, and this awareness was passed down through generations not as written words but as habits, rituals, and instincts of survival. Fires were built smaller and more carefully, their light shielded from open spaces to avoid detection. Camps were placed in locations more defensible, surrounded by stone, hidden within forests, or dug deep into caves where the approach of an enemy could be heard before it was seen. Hunters traveled in larger groups, not only to defend themselves against beasts, but also to ensure that no rival tribe could overwhelm them easily. The tools of daily life carried double purposes. A scraper for hides could become a blade for defense. A digging stick could be sharpened into a spear. Stories told around the fire no longer spoke only of the hunt or the change of seasons, but became warnings about the cruelty of men, about the dangers of trusting too quickly, about the thin line between survival and destruction. The war had taught humanity that violence was never far, that it could rise in moments of hunger or fear, that it could consume entire tribes in a single night. These stories were not told for entertainment, but for preparation, to ensure that the young grew up with the awareness that survival required vigilance, caution, and the willingness to act when threatened. The war had shown that humanity's greatest strength was not merely in numbers or in tools, but in the ability to remember, to learn, and to change, even when that change came at the cost of immense suffering. Through these hard-earned lessons, the survivors began to rebuild, carrying with them a new understanding of the fragility of peace and the heavy price of its absence.
The lessons of the war did not remain confined to the generation that had endured its horrors, but echoed across centuries, woven into the fabric of humanity's rise from fragile tribes to enduring societies. Those who survived carried forward not just memories of fire and blood, but strategies of survival that became foundations for the future. They learned to organize more carefully, to guard resources with vigilance, to defend territory with discipline rather than chaos. The instinct to build alliances emerged as a necessity, for even the smallest cooperation could mean the difference between extinction and survival. The whispers of the massacres became warnings carried in myths and stories, shaping how children understood the dangers of the world long before they could wield weapons themselves. Even as populations slowly recovered, the shadow of the war remained, influencing decisions about where to settle, how to protect families, and when to strike against potential threats. Communities began to shape rituals around conflict, ceremonies of strength meant to deter enemies, demonstrations of unity that declared a tribe too dangerous to provoke. Out of brutality grew the first hints of order, a recognition that unending cycles of vengeance could destroy not just one group, but all humanity together. Yet beneath this fragile order, the memory of violence never vanished. The sharpened edge of stone remained close at hand, and every tool carried the possibility of blood. The war had stripped away illusions of safety, reminding humanity that peace was temporary, fragile, and always vulnerable to hunger, fear, and suspicion. But it also revealed that endurance was possible, that survival could be achieved even in the face of near annihilation. The aftermath, then, was both scar and lesson, a wound that would never fully heal, but would serve as a reminder of the cost of forgetting. Humanity emerged from this crucible, battered and reduced, yet tempered, carrying within it the hard knowledge that to endure meant more than fighting. It meant remembering. Those who lived on did so with the weight of the past pressed into their every step, ensuring that even as they built new fires and carved new tools, they never truly left behind the silence of graves and the smoke of destruction.
The memory of the brutal war lingered like an echo that refused to fade, not bound to the past, but woven into the essence of humanity itself. The survivors had carried scars that time could not erase, and those scars became part of the story of mankind, retold in whispers, reinforced through instinct, and remembered in ritual. The reflection upon such devastation revealed a truth more profound than any single massacre. The violence had not come from an outside force, but from within humanity's own hands. The same ingenuity that crafted tools for survival had turned them into instruments of destruction. The same fire that gave warmth in winter had been used to burn homes and villages to ash. The war was not an isolated tragedy, but a warning, a demonstration that human strength could just as easily become a weapon against itself as a shield against the natural world. Reflection showed that the line between survival and annihilation was thinner than stone blades, fragile and easily broken. To recognize this was to accept that the danger had never truly disappeared. It had only been subdued,
buried beneath layers of memory and the fragile structures of community. The war had proven that humans did not need beasts or storms to push them to the brink of extinction, for their own fear, hunger, and anger were enough to spark devastation. This truth became part of the inheritance of those who lived after, a shadow hanging over every act of cooperation, a reminder carried into every new alliance, that beneath the fragile bonds of trust lay the potential for collapse into violence once more.
The reflection deepened as generations passed, for the war was not remembered only as a tragedy, but as a mirror of what humanity could become under pressure. In the silence that followed the bloodshed, survivors recognized that the seeds of destruction had never truly vanished. They lived within every gathering, every decision, every hunger, and every fear. Communities rebuilt themselves with caution, shaping traditions and boundaries to prevent the chaos of unchecked violence from consuming them again. Still, within those traditions lay the reminder that safety was temporary. The fragile balance of survival depended on cooperation, yet cooperation could fracture at the smallest spark of conflict. Hunger could drive one tribe against another. Fear could transform kinship into suspicion. Desire for land, resources, or dominance could unravel the bonds that kept groups united. Reflection revealed that the same instincts that preserved humanity, adaptability, creativity, resilience, were also the very instincts that made humans dangerous to one another when turned inward. Weapons were no longer just tools of necessity, but symbols of readiness, always close at hand, never truly abandoned even in moments of peace. Stories told to children began to carry double meanings. They were tales of bravery and caution, but beneath them lay warnings about the darkness hidden within humanity itself. Every myth, every ritual fire, every act of preparation carried echoes of the war, reminders that vigilance could not be surrendered. Reflection revealed that survival was not guaranteed by nature alone, but demanded constant awareness of the human heart, a heart capable of generosity and cruelty in equal measure. The brutal war had ended in silence, but the possibility of its return remained alive, carried not in the landscape, but in the very essence of those who lived upon it.
The reflection carried into the future became less a memory of specific battles and more a quiet recognition of the fragility of existence itself. Humanity understood, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that the same capacity for creation and connection that allowed them to build fires, shape tools, and form communities was intertwined with the capacity for destruction. The brutal war that had merely erased them became a silent teacher, instructing every generation that survival was not only about defending against the forces of nature, but also about mastering the storms within their own hearts. The echoes of the conflict shaped how people gathered, how they shared, how they built trust carefully and guarded it fiercely. Rituals of unity were no longer just expressions of belonging, but shields against division, carefully crafted to remind people of their shared identity and fragile peace. Yet even as humanity grew, spreading across new lands, developing new skills, and carving deeper marks into the earth, the awareness of what had once merely ended them followed close behind. Reflection made clear that survival required balance between strength and restraint, between caution and trust, between memory and the will to move forward. The war had taught that forgetting was the most dangerous act of all, for in forgetting lay the risk of repeating the same path into ruin. Thus,
The story of the brutal war was not left to fade, but was carried like an ember, a spark of warning glowing in the collective memory. It whispered that survival was never guaranteed, that peace was always fragile, and that the true test of humanity lay not only in its ability to endure against the external world, but in its ability to endure against itself. This reflection, carved in silence and carried across time, became the final gift of those who had suffered, a legacy of caution and endurance, ensuring that humanity's story would continue, scarred yet unbroken, fragile yet unyielding, moving always forward upon the thin and delicate thread of existence.